we'll figure it out. I raced out of the shower. It felt really appropriate to take a ceremonial bath to cleanse myself.
Yeah.
Before coming up on you. And it's so strange. I was just listening to, I don't know his name, Howl in the Wilderness, that episode that you recorded about your own path and inspiration.
Oh, yeah.
But
James.
Yeah, he coaxed some really good stuff out of you. I think finds its way into this conversation rather seamlessly.
Cool. Can I just ask you a couple technical questions here?
Sure.
So I just want to make sure, since we're not on Zoom, I want to make sure like the audio on Zoom, I usually set it so that there's no background noise coming through. And sometimes in Hawaii, like people start mowing their lawns and there can be background. So I don't know if this format allows me to do that or if the audio sounds pretty good to you. Or
it sounds great. I have the same thing dampened on my end. So really, yeah, it's weird. It's a clear cut straight through from his conversation into this one.
Awesome.
For people who don't know who you are, how do you introduce yourself to people?
I usually don't. I usually don't introduce myself. Like I don't really have a set way that I introduce myself. I say hello. It's funny, I'm still getting used to this I'm a podcaster thing, which can mean all kinds of things in this day and age. Could mean anything, really. Storyteller, student of the mythic, student of the mysteries, someone who's fiddled with sound and story for a long time now and finally found a confluence of sound and story that seemed to flow fairly well. Yeah. So but as you probably noticed from that episode that you're referencing, I tend to try to center the animate work more than myself. Yeah.
The reason for the season is that you're hosting this course, this Embodied Ethics in the Age of AI thing. And it's just almost a miracle that it has come together as it has with Andrew and Andrew Dunn and all of the other folks that are co-facilitating this, because this, in like the find the others kind of way, like it feels a very strong, there's an attractor that is drawing people into a conversation around techne and our use of our tools, their animate properties and agencies. And yeah, so first of all, let's set the stage and talk about where do you see the stakes? What are the stakes of this conversation? Or what are the stakes of dealing with, we're in 2024 and now you can just summon things. It's rather intense.
Yeah. Those are the stakes, right? Now you can just summon things. And it used to take people a lot of initiatory preparation and work and deep inner exploration and communal accountability and all of these kinds of things to be in the position to summon things. The shamanic figure in traditional culture had webs and networks of accountability around them and went through a process that often started at birth to make sure that they were individually prepared to summon things. And now anybody with a laptop and some prior coding experience can summon things. And so the stakes, as I said in a recent Justice episode, quoting early 90s hip-hop band De La Soul, the stakes is high. There's a song called Stakes is High from De La Soul, and I reference that because the stakes are high. The stakes are everything from some of the world altering scenarios that we've all been presented with. Do we entrust humanity in its current state, driven by market forces, driven by chthonic desires and longings that it may not even be aware of, driven by sometimes infantile or adolescent urges? Do we trust humanity with world altering power? Do I trust the guy next door to, you know, have the capacity to fathom the implications of unleashing deep fake videos that can trick billions of people with the click of a button? Do I trust that guy to be able to do that? So there's stakes that are relevant to global economics. There's stakes that are relevant to um, national security. There's all these stakes that I think have been articulated fairly well by people like Center for Humane Technology. And then there's like what you could call deeper individual stakes too. And those are the stakes of what does it mean to be a human being, and what is the effect on somatic structures and consciousness? What is the effect of outsourcing intelligence to things that aren't us, that doesn't live in our bodies? What are the stakes of having all the information in the universe available at our disposal, but yet because of our dependence on technological devices, we can't pay attention for more than 5 seconds, so we can't actually do anything with all that information. And instead of becoming a liberating force, it binds us to a particular devouring, monstrous inevitability. There are biases built into the whole premise of AI. There are biases about intelligence and what intelligence is and what the purpose of life is and the value of computational intelligence, which actually isn't the penultimate human faculty, right? So all of these things are at stake. Everything from global national security to what people are and what they're for and what we're here to do and learn. And I'd say our I'd say the modern world, in the history of industrialization dating back at least a few hundred years, the modern world has cultivated a system that makes it very difficult to recognize wisdom, makes it very difficult to understand that there is such a thing as embodied wisdom and what that would look like. And I think that this surge in AI is going to make it exponentially more difficult to recognize embodied wisdom, because AI, those intelligences may be many things, but they most certainly aren't wise. And wisdom may be exactly what's necessary to work with them and to deal with them. I don't want to sound like the old curmudgeon that's shouting doom and gloom from the mountaintops kind of thing. I think, as with anything, there's going to be all kinds of things. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be horrible. It's going to be just like the human experience. It's going to be many things at once. But I think that there are deep stakes that really need careful attention.
I think about the history of computing and of science generally, and the way that there is this subcurrent that a lot of the mainstream narrative kind of cleaves off. Like Descartes receives the plane from an angelic visitation. This Doug Engelbart, one of the founding fathers of the internet and personal computing, was part of the Institute for Advanced Studies LSD trials in 1955. And Kary Mullis, polymerase chain reaction, he says, okay, we've got this. He credits this advance in understanding biology and computing to an other. And yeah, I'm curious how you reckon with if we're honest about this, and if we're sober in our estimation of what's going on here, then something this is about more than just individual human creative inspiration. This is about a course that is being propelled. I think about Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize in 1973 for dissipative structures, thinking about life as a process that is structuring and then exporting disorder and so on. And are we, how much, like, how do you understand the role of human agency in this? And especially because, like, we have, it's almost cliche that so many of the people involved in AI are on the tailwind. They've got this, some kind of psychedelic origin story. And that seems very central to the unfolding of how much control we actually have in the determination of the evolution of our technologies.
Yeah, I think I'm always in favor of human beings recognizing that there are larger forces at play and deeper drives at work. And that's true for everything that we do. Everything that we do, you mentioned Descartes, and in the modern kind of Cartesian worldview, like, we assume that everything we do is decided by the rational decider that lives within us. And if you really start to examine it, and even scientific studies are verifying this now, like, that's really not how it works. Like, the thing that we call the decider, we're not going to go down this rabbit hole today, probably, but Robert Sapolsky's new book, Determined, is a scientific argument against free will, and basically says that larger forces are determining everything from the scientific perspective. And it's an exhaustive book, and it's really fascinating. You don't have to go to that extreme, but we can start to understand that there are deeper drives at play within us, and there are larger agencies at work, you could say, within the cosmos. Could be the plant medicines determining all of this. But the idea, for example, that the drive to AI, why do you want to create that particular piece of AI technology that allows you to do X, Y, or Z? I want to help humanity. I'm really interested to see if we can do it. It's the cutting edge of technological exploration. And by the way, I'm interested, and maybe it'll get really popular and I'll make $1 billion and all this kind of thing. Yeah, that's all fine and good, but that doesn't quite get at it. Like, when we're talking about tinkering with world altering powers, there are other drives at play. There are other things going on. There is a religiosity to it, which you named, that's been present right from the beginning. It's been a spiritual exploration of, a natural human unfoldment of our relationship with larger powers. We need there to be larger powers. And if we live in a post-rationalist world where there are no larger powers, we'll find ways to create larger powers, because human beings actually inhabit a world of larger powers, and we're looking for that. And at the same time, we like to tinker with the mysterious thing. I call it, in the episode on AI that I did, I call it the mystery drive. Like, human beings are driven to this point of mystery and the question of, I wonder what would happen if. And it's that place where you could say the natural awe and wonder at the beauty of creation turns a little bit into this, if I just tinker with this a little bit. And it's the same drive that drives, like, little kids to say, oh, I wonder what happens if I fry the ant with the magnifying glass, or I see it as an extension of the exact same thing. And that drive, which is a drive for destruction, it's a drive towards mystery, it's a drive for, like, exploration into the great unknown. All of this is recognized in traditional cultures as something that is like a natural part of human development, but that also needs containment around it. It needs to be curbed. You don't just, give the kids huge magnifying glasses and tell them to go burn down the schools, right? You temper it. The drive to want to know what lives at the heart of reality, the drive to want to encounter that mystery, that drive to want to tinker with the mystery, really, I feel it's a deep human longing for reconnection. It's a deep human longing to be reconnected and to be guided by wise elders, and to be taken through a process through which we can actually start to embody knowledge. It's like saying, hey, look, I need some guidance. I'm trying to figure this out. What happens if I fry an ant with a magnifying glass? What happens if I throw that frog against the wall? All these like little boy explorations, like it's a longing, it's a cry to the larger world and to larger structures of ritual initiation that existed within cultures. It's a cry to say, guide me. I'm at the phase where I'm finding out the heart of the mystery and I need some guidance here. And so I think that there are always larger forces that are guiding human beings towards a recognition of great mysteries and of forces that are larger than us. And I think that's at play here. I think there's a deep spiritual longing at play. I think ultimately, in a post religious world, supposedly, I think that human beings have a longing for greater agencies and greater powers that, when it's unmet, will find ways to meet it. And then there are deep longings within ourselves, deep forces within ourselves that are guiding it too, that are like the natural developmental forces of human beings, inquisitiveness and our relationship with mystery, but that need to be tempered and anchored and held in wisdom, basically. I don't know if that gets at what you're
I
searching
mean,
for there, but
yeah, sure. We just keep stacking logs on the fire.
yeah.
I I would love to prompt you to just reflect on I having listened to you talk about your upbringing and about the imminence of a living world. I would love to hear you talk about how you understand the precise sort of ontology of the forces that are coming through. You have Buddhist parents. You spent a substantial amount of your childhood in India. New Mexico has a this the Tibetan Buddhist community. One of the things I loved about the episode that you produced on So You Want to Be a Sorcerer in the Age of Mythic Powers was about this thing about and golems. I come from half of my family's Ashkenazi Jewish, working in the complex systems science scene with the Santa Fe Institute for a while. There, I am surrounded, and New Mexico generally, it's just there's a lot of this post-war Jewish diaspora stuff. I was talking about this with Sam Arbisman, who's working on a book on computing and code and magic right now. And the Golem stop codes that it turns out that a lot of the researchers in AI at MIT all found out that they had inherited this thing, which was that this myth had been around for a while. That this is the point is this is very deep. This is not a new phenomenon. The idea of using one's imagination to instantiate agencies in the world that act algorithmically in ways that surprise us because much like with the psychedelic experience we there's always you write the code and then you take the trip and then you realize in retrospect because of mind expansion that something you missed a line in the code, you missed some important thing like the monkey's paw. Yeah, I don't know precisely what I'm getting at, but I would love to hear you talk about how you understand reckoning with these kinds of powers and how we might start to, in a secular way, because a lot of these people building these tools are, uh, they have an ultimate concern. There is a religiosity to it, but it's, yeah, I don't know. I'll just let that kind of wash out and you take it from here.
Yeah, the stuff around golems is very interesting, right? Referencing like the Golem of Prague and the old Jewish tale of a creature that was basically magically brought into being, an intelligence that was brought into being in order to protect a particular community that was facing repression. And so the rabbi animates this golem and brings him to life and puts him to protect that community. And then the golem ends up killing the very people that he was designed to protect. And then the notion that there is like a spell that's placed on the golem's tongue to animate, and then there's also a spell to deanimate, to stop the golem when the time comes to stop the golem. A question for the AI world is, do we have the codes to stop the golem? Right? To, like, the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which I also tell in that episode, is a story in which the young apprentice unleashes all these things, and then he doesn't have the understanding of how to contain once it's unleashed. And it's a lot easier to unleash something than to contain it once it's unleashed. And that's a very simple thing that humanity seems to have a hard time grappling with or learning, right? Unleashing things is easy. Unleashing things, like, it takes very little energy to unleash something, right? Containment is much more challenging. And containment comes with wisdom, right? The ability to contain something. So yeah, some of these early AI programmers and researchers, as you're referencing, were very familiar with the story of the Golem of Prague. Some of them equated what they were doing with AI to sorcery directly. Like I say in the episode, there's been magic in the AI mix from the start. It has not been removed from what you could call spiritual discussions and spiritual considerations. It's been in there right from the start. And yeah, some of the early guys at MIT being told the code during their bar mitzvahs, as one story goes, that can deanimate the golem, right? So this story of the golem it's right there at the heart of AI. And what's important to understand now, because you start talking about magic and sorcery and people think I'm speaking in metaphors and this kind of thing, what's important to understand now is that the golem is real. And we're literally animating intelligences that affect us, right? And the question always comes, oh, you're talking about magic, you're talking about these powers, you're talking about how human beings have worked with these powers. These powers aren't actually real, right? You're just talking, they're real in that they have effects on people. They're real. And Dan Carlin, Hardcore History, and Rick Rubin have talked about this quite a bit. They had an awesome discussion about this. If something is perceived as magic, and that magic has an effect on massive populations, the mother of Dionysus is a sorceress who can summon great powers, or Alexander the Great is a sorceress that can summon great powers. People believe that, and it changes the course of a battle, and it changes the course of history. That's real, quote unquote, magic. That's actually having a tangible effect. You don't have to get into a scientific discussion about whether the magic is actually, quote unquote, real, because for all intents and purposes, what's happening is tangible. So if somebody unleashes a deep fake video that causes billions of people to see the world in a particular way, and it alters their perception and it alters their consciousness, that's real. That's tangible. Doesn't matter if the video is fake or not. You can say, oh, people, just like the people who didn't see that video, they weren't affected, so therefore that's not real, right? That's what people say historically about magic, right? It's, yeah, but people have all bought into a cultural system in which this is tangible and real. AI wouldn't mean anything if it wasn't plugged in. If we weren't all plugged in, AI wouldn't mean anything. If 90% of human beings lived in the woods and there were just a couple people with computers trading intelligence with each other, that's the same with money. It's like it gains value and agency and power because we're all bought into a particular way of seeing the world. So the magic that's at play in AI, when you're talking about the ability to alter consciousness and alter perception and make zeros disappear in people's bank accounts and like all of these things, it's real because we've bought into that system in which it's real. Understanding mythos, understanding that culture upon culture for hundreds of years, thousands of years, have had stories of exactly what happens when people tinker with things that they're not prepared to tinker with, when they dig too deep and unleash forces that live under the ground, like these types of stories. We can say, oh, those stories are metaphors, but that doesn't really matter because what they're talking about is something incredibly real within the human experience. and this is what we're, this is what we're working with now. And so it's helpful to understand it from a mythic perspective. It's helpful to understand it from the perspective of we're tapping into large forces that have the potential to cause great change in the human story. And the number one question then becomes, are we prepared and do we understand what it means to actually work with those forces responsibly? And to work historically, like in traditional cultures, to work with any kind of perceived power, right? And it doesn't matter if you or I think that power was quote unquote real or not. To work with any type of perceived power required gradual initiation, slow learning, a community of accountability. All of the fail safes that are built into traditional culture have deep relevance for how we work with AI. People can talk about shamans and sorcerers and say, oh, from a scientific perspective, that power that they had, that wasn't quote unquote real. That's open for plenty of discussion, but ultimately that's irrelevant because recognized powers that have been recognized across cultures need the same type of initiatory framework, the same type of communal framework, the same type of accountability around them. So I think we have a lot to learn from how traditional cultures have worked with what they perceive to be great power as it relates to the AI question.
Yeah. Okay. So I was just at South by Southwest talking with Gary Marcus,
Mm,
who is a very prominent kind of Chicken Little about AI, goes into the congressional hearings and says we need regulation
mm,
on these things. And yeah, of course, you got a Stuart Brand's paste layers issue here, which is that we think a lot of people, I think of regulation as something that occurs at the level of the state. I think you and I both understand that regulation in a complex system occurs at every level of that system.
mm,
So when you're talking about initiation, we're talking about the I keep coming back to this Ian Malcolm's riff in Jurassic Park about giving kids guns, or you said the magnifying glass, that the executive function, the prefrontal cortex has not matured yet.
mhm,
And I'll have to look back on it, but it's like, I think it was Mark Andreessen posted recently. There was a graph that showed the incidence of risk taking behavior in young people and showed like criminal activity and then showed startups, this kind of thing, and how basically the kind of foolishness that we get into as teenagers softens somewhat but takes on a new form and is basically the same kind of foolishness that we get into when we decide that we're going to disrupt a particular economic sector with
mm,
some technological innovation. And again, like, where are the elders in the room here? This is a huge theme on Future Fossils, stretching all the way back to the beginning of this show, which is it's like kids waking up in a car that has spun out of control and
mm,
being like, okay, now how do we teach ourselves to drive?
mm,
What does it look like? What does a wisdom school for innovation look like to you? How do we get there? Obviously, it can't be a monolithic entity. Regulation at the state level isn't enough. I want to tie in one more thing, which is that Harvard Berkman Klein fellow Johnny Penn recently wrote this piece on Time Magazine, how the next tech backlash will be about hygiene, talking about people who feel the need to step away from the flood of information. I spoke with Kiki Sanford recently on This Week in Science, and she was talking about a paper that came out, I'll link in the show notes, on information overload. And it's interesting, like AI in one sense is a way that we can create an intermediating layer that allows us to process the overwhelming intensity of everything so that we can make better decisions.
mm.
But how do we, as Nicholas Carr in his book, The Glass Cage, which is a huge influence on this show, talks about there being two different kinds of automation. There's the kind of automation that makes commercial airline pilots lazy and forget their flight training. And so they don't know how to respond in a disaster. And they make the stupid, like, day one mistake that a student would make, and they end up killing people. And then there's an automation that's like the way that open world gaming creates a context where you learn by doing and you engage in a kind of graduated way
Mm.
with this stuff. So again, the access is pretty much, that ship has sailed. We're not at the point where we can say only certain people should do this. It's like having kids, or like America's done a terrible job of driver education and these kinds of things. How do we inculcate responsibility at the right point in a person's development? It's a huge question,
Yeah.
but I think part of it is this question about knowing how deep to go, like knowing how much to allow for yourself, but the community has to be involved, right? Because the individual, in some respects, can't be trusted to make these decisions for themselves. If you're 18 and you've got Chat GPT and you're pissed off, you're black pilled, and we're going to see all kinds of crazy stuff. How do we help evolve the cultural norms and protocols of society? I guess there's a whole sort of taxonomy of processes and protocols and institutions and affordances for helping people maintain agency and stay on the loop in this kind of stuff. And I'd love to hear you
Mm.
I'd love to hear you on how you think this is plausibly going to unfold, like how we can encourage people not just to eat the candy.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's particularly relevant since Easter just passed and I have two little ones, and like trying to manage two little ones in the face of the sugar industrial complex. It's no, trust me, you really don't want to eat that much candy. Right. Like what you're opening up is obviously a massive topic, and you and I are going to get to talk a lot more about it in the upcoming course too. I think that there are people obviously who are looking at external regulation like you're talking about. And I think that type of regulation is important. It's important to have those discussions. There are things in our culture that are regulated. You mentioned guns, somewhat regulated. But for example, you and I can't go buy like anti-aircraft weaponry and this type of thing on the open market. And some of this AI technology is, in terms of its scope and scale of potential consequences, up there with that kind of thinking. If you're going to not allow a 19-year-old kid to have a beer, then why would that 19-year-old kid be able to hack into the mainframe and start messing with things that could have serious repercussion on the world around them? So external regulation, all that to say that external regulation is important. Like it's important to have external regulation around this kind of thing. And then you're also saying, like, where are the elders? There's a deep culture change that's necessary. I think many people recognize that in many ways these days. But our society, when I say our, technological modernity as a society, tends to reward like we talked about earlier, it tends to reward the unleashing of things, and yet have no long-term vision for the containment and slow growth and development and rooting and all of the other aspects of the growth cycle. Like growth cycles exist within nature all around us, and we can see those growth cycles. And if you put too much emphasis on one phase of the growth cycle and not on another phase of the growth cycle, you're not going to grow a very good garden, because you have to pay attention to all of it. So we tend to prioritize and reward the like kind of reckless innovator freeform. Yeah, look at this innovation discovery. Let's throw $1 billion of venture capital at it. Not only is it the kids waking up and saying, who knows how to drive? The kids aren't even saying who knows how to drive. They're saying, go faster. that culture, we'll figure out the whole regulatory stuff. We'll figure out the consequences later. Let's get this FDA approved when it and then we'll figure out the actual consequences later. Like, there needs to be a deep culture change around that. And really, I can only describe that, like Tyson Yunkaporta, the author of Sand Talk, like he talks about modernity as adolescent culture, and it's a very adolescent thing to look only at the aspects of culture that are, hey, let's do this and I can do this and what do I get to do next, I can do it. Cultures that are more mature and that last longer have those deep systems of accountability built in. I think that there's external regulation necessary. I think that there's culture change necessary. And of course, the question then becomes, how do you create culture change? Saying blanketly we have to start to value wisdom more can sound just like talking into the void, because what does that look like and what does that mean? But it's like, one of the main things that I always talk about when I talk about this topic is slowing down. And when I say that, the immediate response is, well, that's not how these companies are going to work. And that's not how this is. And it doesn't matter. Like, it's very important to have a voice that says, slow down. It's very important, because I know that some people are going to hear that. And I know that some people are going to listen and pause and think about what that means. And when I say slow down, when do you hear our leaders say slow down? When do you, in this modern kind of frenzied machine, like when do you hear elders say, hey, slow down? That doesn't need to come out tomorrow. That doesn't need to be something that we jump on immediately. That's something that we can wait and we can foster. Words like steeping and fostering and all the things that make for really good soup and the cauldron of our lives, right? All the things that make for really good soup take time. Take time, develop it slowly, cultivate it slowly. That first, I can think as an artist, I can think like that first idea. I used to I was really in love with first ideas. That first insight, that first idea, and that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do this. And then I go down this spiraling rabbit hole that, because I didn't lay any foundational work and really steepen it and really develop it and really start to understand and feel into it and really ultimately understand if it's actually something I want to be working on. I think a lot of coders get caught in this thing where they get so excited by the shiny carrot that it's just, oh yeah, that's it. That's what I want to do. I want to chase that. Oh yeah, throw some money at me. Let's do it. Let's chase that. And then maybe you hit the jackpot. Maybe you don't. You hit the jackpot, then that kind of way of thinking gets reinforced in you. And then you're on to the next thing. And what's the next thing? Next thing. You never actually, and then maybe you wake up when you're 40 something and you're like, none of that was actually stuff that I really care about. None of that was actually stuff that I really like feel is aligned with what you could call like my core soul vision. All in this kind of relentless need that modernity has to move things forward. So we have to have voices that are saying slow down. And the more voices that are saying slow down, it may not reach the CEO of Microsoft, but it may reach somebody somewhere along the way. Has a much likelier chance of reaching someone younger, I think, that's not so stuck in their ways, right? And it might cause them to say, you know what? That thing that I was going to launch into, maybe I really want to take my time to develop it. Maybe I want to take my time to feel out like what it is and what it looks like over the long term and how aligned it is. I think that then there has to be, like, it's strange for us in the modern world to contemplate a system like many traditional cultures have, where there's some type of internal work that has to accompany external work. It's not something we think of very often. But in certain traditions, to handle metal required like going through ceremonies first. To be a metal worker, you had to go through a preparatory process. If you wanted to be you could look at Japanese culture for this for a lot of examples traditionally. Not as much anymore, of course, but traditionally, no, before you are entrusted with this thing, there's a process you need to go through first. So the way I see that has to work is locally, communally, but also perhaps built into the education system a little bit more. And that means more than having one little tiny, if you're studying AI coding and part of it is hands-on work coding and part of it is business marketing and part of like all the things that you're studying. And then you have this little tiny portion of what you're studying that's called ethics. Yeah. that's the compartmentalization of ethics. And when the overall culture around you does not value that whatsoever and says, yeah, yeah, okay, yeah, yeah, do your little ethics course thing, but really what you want to do is go for the shiny carrot, like that is not how ethics needs to be embedded into the conversation. It needs to be embedded into the conversation much more deeply. So that I think maybe a shock to the listeners, but I use AI for research. Like AI has been profoundly helpful over the past year for helping distill knowledge and funnel it and give me areas where I can look a little deeper into certain things. There are ways that it can be used in a tutorial manner that are beautiful, but our commitment to the basics of what you could call the natural life cycle of things has to be there first in order for that to be effective and not just run away like the way that social media has run away with all of our young people. We have to have a commitment to understanding the phase of planting and the phase of preparing the soil, right? And the phase of slow growth tending and the phase of fruiting, blossoming and fruiting, and the phase of decomposition and the phase of death. And how do these things come into being and how do they end and what is their natural life cycle and how do we tend them well? And tending, stirring, using my cauldron metaphors a lot because we're studying that in the course I'm teaching right now. Tending, stirring, steeping, percolating, all of these words that when really the primary word we're concerned with in the modern world is rushing. Let's rush it to market. Let's get it out there. Let's get it out there. So that steeping, tending, stirring, preparing needs to be built into me as an individual through the people around me and through the educational systems I'm in. It needs to be built into the structure of companies more. It needs to be built into the overall federal regulations around it all. And ultimately, I think, and this is not an area where I'm an expert, but I can imagine a lot. Ultimately, I think it needs to be built into the code itself. I think that the code itself, if you look at how powers have been worked with traditionally, if you look at like a ritual that's designed to summon powers, oftentimes 90% of that ritual will be about establishing the container. And then the actual ritual, the actual potency is just a tiny little part of it. And the networks of accountability that I think could be built into the code itself is an area that I think needs a lot of consideration and exploration. Because right now, AI is basically mirroring the modern human. It's disconnected, it's intelligence disembodied. It's this kind of roving, fairly like Chat GPT is like fairly neoliberal. It doesn't think it is, but it's basically, like I said in the episode, it's kind of talking to a slightly disconnected neoliberal Stanford grad. No offense to slightly disconnected neoliberal Stanford grads out there. It has a personhood and a personality, and we're magnifying that, right? And I think really deeply looking at their way within the code itself to give these intelligences more of what you could call a context and a body. That's an area perhaps for imaginative innovation. Uh, yeah, so that's a long answer to a long stream, and I think it has to take place at every level, and I think there are ways that it can. I don't think it's I don't culture change happens. Culture change does happen. We have very different cultural attitudes now towards things than we did 40 years ago in a number of different ways. I happen to think that the era of people like walking around like zombies staring into their phones like this is going to be incredibly short-lived actually. And that doesn't mean I think technology is going away, but I think in 25 years people are going to look back at this particular period and be like, what were you thinking? I think it's going to look extremely strange to people 25 years from now,
Maybe
even
so.
to say that people aren't going to be onto some weirder stuff. I don't know. You probably saw that video of the guy in the Bay Area sitting in his self-driving car while wearing his VR headset. And yeah, there's going to be stranger stuff happening too. But it's hard when you're swimming in it. But the somatic impacts of phones on the entire younger generation, especially, that's not sustainable. It's not going to sustain. Either it's going to cause so many mental health problems that it's going to be regulated, or people are just going to start somatically rejecting it themselves. They're just going to start turning away from it because it's so profoundly toxic. So culture change happens, and it ultimately is determined, you could say, by the body of a culture and how the body responds to actual cause and effect. And I think that like the way we're using technology is untenable, and so it will start to change. The body of the culture will start to reject it in various ways.
Agreed. In that interview I was just listening to you and Howl in the Wilderness, I just wanted to speak to one thing real briefly before moving forward. I loved that you said modern culture is ahead of the one, like in the musical sense. This rushing, the rushing to
Mm.
get somewhere, and it's funny because that shows up everywhere. It shows up even in the the way that this course was supposed to
Mhm.
be like it was initially scheduled for months ago,
Yeah.
and then everybody was like, "Pump the brakes! Like let's actually feel for when it makes sense to actually do this. Let's get the right people in the room. Let's not be so hasty to get out the door." So that's the thing. But the bigger thing, maybe, and the thing I want to unpack with you a little bit more is this piece about amplification. Another person I feel in the room with us all the time on this particular issue is Doug Rushkoff. And Doug gave a talk at BetaWorks last year where he called language models instant technological karma. And he was saying it's like everybody's heard garbage in, garbage out, but like the more generalizable statement is that these tools are amplifying the inferences based on the statistical associations that are patterned into them according to the frame, according to everything that's left out. And so I remember back in 2016, when my thinking on this issue really came into focus after listening to Robin Hanson talking about his book, The Age of M, talking about what would happen to the human economy as soon as we can create like human equivalent digital agents. And so if we can sideload or upload people and then have uh, certain patterns of human cognition that are operating according to the abundances, the specific abundances and scarcities of the digital platform as opposed to the analog platform. Basically, you're going to see a rapid proliferation of whatever biases were seeded into that first generation of digital people. And so I started thinking, oh my God, like if that's the case, then it's the machine, like Marvin Minsky said back decades ago. The machine these are our mind children. And we need to treat the cultivation of AI with the same kind of care. And we've been talking about this already for a while, that we treat the raising of our own children.
Mm.
And so what do you want? What of us do we want to see carried forward into this new milieu? And so I gave a talk at Boom Festival about this, in which I said, obviously, like we want to scan lovers, we want to scan poets, we want to amplify the best of us. We want that reflected. And so when I was talking with Sam Arbisman about this, Sam turned me on to this guy, Zohar Atkins, who's building a conversational agent based on the Talmud. It's okay, let's embrace this, but let's do it in a way that amplifies the inherited wisdom that we have available to us. Let's not just follow the YouTube or Spotify recommendation algorithm all the way down into our lowest common Molochian denominator. Let's have this thing. And so recently, I would love for you to play with this and see what comes out of it. A listener of my show, Van Betauer, a conversational agent based on this podcast,
Mm.
and it's askfuturefossils.com is an interface it's talking to me, but it's also drawing from everything that everyone else has said on the show all the way back to 2016. And I love this thing. Like it seems to me so much more soulful, so much less of this sort of dissociated neoliberal Stanford grad that you're talking about with ChatGPT, or like the weird forced woke conformist thing that was going on with Gemini, where it was like black redhead Roman marriage couples things that it took over the web a while back, where they were, it's like, show me a ancient Roman married couple, and it was like giving you this thing that was like subservient to current pressures on representation.
Right.
Instead, what we have is this, I ask the future fossils corpus to talk to me about reality or the future of selfhood, and it gives me an answer that, and again, this is confirmation bias because I'm the training data, right? And I'm built out of these conversations that, in a way, this, but it gets interesting when you can tune this medium in a way that amplifies the things that you're actually hoping for in the world. And I would love to hear you talk about, you can imagine for a mature integration of AI such that it functions more as the angel on our shoulder rather than the devil on the
Mm.
other shoulder. Like what would you like to see this turn into? How would you like to see it actually implemented so that people have scaffolding for the cultivation of their own conscience and for right relations in their behavior in the world?
Yeah. First off, somebody did that with the Emerald too, where they made like a chat interface based on the, but it wasn't that good at all. It didn't evoke the same kind of mythic linguistics, or it didn't feel right to me. Um,
Mm.
First off, I think it's important to recognize that bias that we've been talking about. Like that bias is an incredibly real thing, and that bias has to do with how modern humans view intelligence and how we may not know so much in modern culture that there even is such a thing as wisdom, or that there's a difference between intelligence and wisdom and this kind of thing. And there was one of them, I'm forgetting who, but one of the major players in the AI world basically say you create the intelligence and the intelligence solves everything. It solves all the issues. And the issue is that intelligence by itself doesn't actually solve things. Intelligence can expand our informational capacity around certain things, and it can bring perspectives and insights, but it in and of itself does not solve, right? It takes embodied humans to do that. And I think that's a deeply important recognition. Meaning everyone talking about how AI is going to save the world, human beings have all of the information we need to end global hunger and to address climate change and this type of thing. We don't need any more information. Now, can AI be incredibly helpful in modeling? Sure. I think it can come up with models that human beings have probably never even dreamed of, which is amazing. But it's still going to take embodied human beings to implement that change. And to do that, we have to want it. And to want it, we might have to address certain overall structural imbalances. And to address those structural imbalances, we may have to slow down and embody things over time. And that's the challenge, like that we haven't wanted to do that. AI is a sliver of the human experience of the world magnified exponentially, right? It's a sliver of how human beings process information and make decisions, and it's magnified. Within that, is there room for a whole lot more perspective? Sure. I think it would be interesting to have AI music tutors who have wandered the earth in their in their deep reservoirs of what they're drawing from and studied like all the musical traditions of the world, and or like I say in the episode, like talking to AI, talking to Chat GPT is nothing like talking to an Aboriginal elder, right? It's nothing like it. Why is it nothing like it? While ChatGPT, while it tries to remain fairly balanced and open and respectful of like spiritual and religious beliefs, for example, and if you ask it like questions about the existence of spirit and this type of thing, it's going to deflect and defer and try to hold everything like equally. It's not going to tell you definitively the same way wisdom holder from a traditional culture would. It's not going to tell you definitively like we live in a world through which the breath of life flows, and the breath of life flows through us. And it's important that we all learn what it means to tend to that vital breath of life as it exists within ecology and within ourselves, right? The current model is not going to say those things. We may be coming to a point in human history where it's necessary to say things definitively and not just hold all. I try to be respectful of all that's supposedly non-biased, but when that's not actually historically a non-biased perspective, it's a very biased perspective. To say that like all visions of the world are equally valid, which AI will, or ChatGPT in its current iteration will try to do. We may need those, yeah, those perspectives, those human perspectives. And if we want to code them into AI, we can. But those perspectives that say definitively, like I said in the episode, animism is normative consciousness, like human beings have historically for 99.9% of our history viewed this living world as alive and animate and teeming with forces. And that type of perspective is actually important. And it changes how you view systems, and it changes how you view sustainability, and it changes how you build cities, and it changes how you work with rivers and all these things. So in all of the modeling that AI is going to be doing for how to solve current problems, we need those types of perspectives. And what it'll ultimately, I think, ultimately, the wisdom that allowed traditions like the Aboriginal tradition to survive for 70,000 plus years, or the cultures of the Kalahari to survive for 70,000 plus years, that wisdom is extremely simple and it's extremely deep. And ultimately, all of our vast imaginal modelings are probably going to come back to wisdom that human beings have known innately and inherently for tens of thousands of years. And this is where I am faced with the question, is it better to go out on these kind of wild tangents of programming AI Zohar perspectives, or should we just go study with a living person? And we're speculating and imagining, and I don't have a sense that AI is going to disappear. So I think within the what's coming with AI, I think that exploring those more artistic or more like mystical visions of the AI voice will probably be interesting and informative. But I'm also firmly of the mind that like the basic somatic knowledge that teaches humans how to be human needs to come from humans. I think it needs to come from parents. I think it needs to come from community. It needs to come from time spent in the wilderness. I think it needs to come from slow, deep learning models. And I think that at its very best, AI can act as like a tutor enhancement of those types of. Yeah, when I go to the doctor, I would love for there to be like deep AI modeling systems so that like there can be better capabilities for diagnosis, all of this kind of thing. Like I would love for there to be like the AI music tutor that I talked about. But I fundamentally like for human beings to embody knowledge, it has to happen in the body and it has to happen in relation to other bodies. And I really don't think there's any getting away from that. And that's how human beings have to, especially modern human beings, have to understand that having access to information and knowing things theoretically isn't the same thing as embodying them. And I know that sounds simple and perhaps even trite, but it's the most basic foundational thing. It's like embodying something is an entirely different process, and it's fundamental to like what we pass on to our kids, and it's fundamental to all of this. It has to be learned and processed and embodied. And like my young ones are going to learn a whole lot about the world by how I walk through it in my body as someone who they interact with every single day, how I walk through it in my body, how I carry myself, how I bring perhaps certain ritual into our lives, or I take time before a meal to offer some gratitude, or I light a candle on our little family shrine, or I make a point of taking them out to look for shells, or I explain to them like different varieties of plants, like the ones that I have on my shirt, which is a plant that grows here in Hawaii and was brought by Polynesians over 1,000 years ago, is the taro plant. The fact that kids know all of this digital lingo right now, but they can't name 5 plants that grow in their local community. This is a serious thing, because ultimately we are in relation with our local ecology, and we're in relation on a deeper level than we like to admit in a world of what Tyson Yunkaporta calls long ass supply chains. I have a conversation with him coming up that I'm really looking forward to. We have to, as much as we are speculating and traveling and journeying into the beyond, we have to be anchored right here in the somatic reality too. And this, I'll just tell, since we're like freestyling a little bit here. I was out in San Francisco for the Wisdom 2.0 AI conference in October. And I used to live in San Francisco, and it was my first time back in like downtown San Francisco in a while. And it was the day that the Techno Optimist Manifesto came out, which was written by a prominent like capital investor in the tech and AI worlds, who's, I'm not as good with names as you are, so I'm forgetting his name. But it's this horrendous piece of writing that technology is how we got from mud huts to the stars, and we're all going to live on Mars one day, and this is progress, and you can't stop progress. And anyone who's questioning any technological innovation is questioning like the fundamentals of what it means to be human and all this kind of stuff. That came out on that day. And it was also the first day that I ever saw a self-driving car. I hadn't seen that yet. So I'm walking in the streets of San Francisco, and there's like I saw 2 self-driving cars like zipping around down there. I'm looking up into the sky, and I'm like, wow, there's this weird kind of energetic Star Trek veneer over this place. It's like this vision of tech utopia. And then I'm walking through downtown San Francisco, and there's people with no place to sleep, like out on the streets, and it's a mess. It's an absolute mess, you know.
Star Trek
And
called that one too, by the way. Deep Space
yeah,
Nine, 2024. We're almost there.
yeah, yeah, and a lot of that Star Trek stuff did take place in the Bay Area. That's where Starfleet Command was based, right? But what I saw was not a utopian vision. What I saw looked a lot more like a dystopia. It looked a lot more, yeah, there's a certain percentage of the privileged population that can dream about going to the stars and this kind of thing. And meanwhile, we haven't addressed the most fundamental, basic situations here on planet Earth. And to do that, you need love and compassion and embodied. You need people to actually say, this is enough of a priority that I actually care about this, that maybe I'm going to drop my dream of creating some chat bot that's going to make me $1 billion and focus instead on how to end global hunger and deal with the person who's right in front of me who needs some assistance. And that ultimately is what human beings, I feel, need to do and need to focus on. And that's embodied knowledge, like actual embodied knowledge coming from a sympathetic, empathetic place. And it's a weird imagining that we could AI ourselves back to compassion when AI simulations for how we're going to deal with the problems in the world might come back to, ultimately, you need to take care of this problem by addressing the person right in front of you who needs. But we may be at that place where human beings need to go all the way through the abstraction funnel to take us all the way back to the simple realizations that what matters most is the person who's standing right in front of us.
Absolutely. And actually, listening to you talk about this, I think like the last kind of kernel for us to explore here has to do with I am not a I'm not somebody who grew up situated in a deep, rich seam of inherited elder wisdom. And in fact, my parents, bless them, were always very much on this find your own way. This is it's a modern virtue to say, oh, your kid should be self-determining. Whatever you want to do, as long as you can make it work, that's good. And I've found, and I was talking about this recently in some of the discussions I hosted with Future Fossils group around Robert Bly's book Iron John, and about how all of this stuff is constellated through mythopoetic thinking in boyhood to manhood and so on. Uh, I want to know my dad did for a living. I want to be there in that space. And he, bless him, he's done so much for me and my family, but like he's always been like, that was my life. This is your life. And so I feel like a lot of us are starting from a place of abstraction and displacement. And so when I'm with my kids here in Santa Fe and I'm walking them around the neighborhood, and I want them to name not just 5. I want them to name like 30 to 50 different local plants. I want them to look around and know what's growing out of the sidewalk. But for me, what that means is in often it means saying, "Oh, let's scan this with my phone. Let's look at Google Lens and put this up there and see what it is, and you and I are going to learn together." And I think that that kind of speaks to the question of what it means to anchor to restore or retrieve norms around initiation and the integration and embodiment of all this stuff. But like the last thing I want to say is that like you
Can I say
had
something on
yeah,
what you just
please.
said real quick?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say something because what you said really struck a note with me. And I'm a relatively new parent, so I'm not some expert on parenting in any way, shape, or form. But I'm learning a lot and realizing a lot. And one of the things I'm realizing is exactly what you just said. I can see how if what I do all day long is abstract for them, I can see the direction that's going to send them on. I can see their want to be included and involved. So, like for me, I do a lot of obviously with the podcast audio recording stuff, but also music production and that kind of thing. And I've already identified this as a place where, yeah, I'm going to bring them in to the music production craft, like right from the start, because that's give that and I can see the bonding potentiality and the potentiality for incredible creative collaboration and all that. And maybe eventually they reject it, and who knows? And but to have those, and obviously like time in the wilderness and what I know of natural systems, and that's going to come into a lot too, like when we go hiking, and even yesterday looking for seashells and identifying different seashells with my son and that kind of thing. But the very basis of how knowledge used to be passed from parent to child, it's not just for the transfer of knowledge, right? It's like it it establishes that child in a web of relationships and establishes what the place of that parent is within their entire cosmos. And I think this is something we have to be really careful of in the AI world. Like AI can be an enhancement to a child's learning process eventually, a researcher, a tutor, that kind of thing. But it's absolutely vital, I believe, that the foremost tutors and elders and passers on of knowledge are deeply involved human beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Deeply involved human beings. So yeah, it just made me want to flag that because I felt this exact thing, like, oh, I need to pass a craft onto them. Yeah, I need to pass on a specific craft. And I'm working to, like, through example, show them how me and my wife approach like spiritual practice, how we approach the kind of general rhythm of our lives, how we approach time in the natural world and knowledge of local ecology, but also very specifically the passing on of a craft, I think is vital, of some kind. Yeah.
So this may seem like something of a tangent, but I just want to say after the AI episode on your show, you did a two-parter on Sears.
Mm.
And I am somebody who has found either solidarity and fraternity or has alienated people through being candid and honest about the way that my own intuitive access has shaped my life and my decision making. And so there's an interesting polarity that I would love to hear you speak on in our closing here, which is that recently one of my favorite papers that I've seen come out of AI, and for by courtesy of working part time on an open source AI startup in communications, and a startup that's concerned about all of these issues that we're talking about. How do we do this wisely? How do we make this as situated as possible? I came across this paper: hallucination is inevitable, an innate limitation of large language models, which I
Mm-hmm.
love, because it's basically saying, it's like Gödel's incompleteness theorem or something. It's saying there's no way of getting around the fact that there are going to be errors in our modeling. And again, Rushkoff recently posted this thing: the model is not the territory. This comes up again and again in these conversations. And so I'm glad to see so many people bringing this to the surface and the forefront, which is that no matter, like, our best guess about the world, that gap that you said, this, the drive that people have into mystery, is because we know on some level that the map is not going to cut it, that the abstraction is not the embodied physical thing. It's not the sense of being on the landscape itself or in relation with the land as a thou. And yet here we have, in a way, I guess what I'm saying, and what I'd like to hear you speak to, is I think that there's a profound misunderstanding going on in what people are expecting of these technologies,
Mm-hmm.
which has to do with them being able to reason for us,
Yeah.
when in fact, in a way, what they are is an externalization of our own dreaming and hallucinatory, if you want to call it that, our own visionary capacities. That it's not a bug in this medium, that it doesn't give you specifically the thing you asked for, in the
Mm-hmm.
same way that, like I was saying earlier, that like whatever line of code you leave out of the algorithmic coding, the programming of your set and setting in a psychedelic experience. Richard Doyle talks about this in Darwin's Pharmacy, and I love him for it. Maybe the thing is the way that these tools show us the unknown, and so, like, recently Peter Limberg posted this article on how he's been given, he was the founder and facilitator of the Stoa,
Mm-hmm.
and he posted this thing on how he's been given an opportunity to be a chief philosophy officer in a company. And this is like my dream job, right? Oh my God, this is so clearly for, if you can't afford it, if you can't afford the human mentorship, then okay, like at least we have this sort of the Talmud AI substitute thing. If you can't afford the human counsel, it does seem it comes down to economic privilege in some respect. But I started asking people, like, okay, yeah, Athens had Delphi. What does your organization have? How are you? And I don't think that it's about getting AI to march the way that you want it to. I think it's about provoking, uh, it's like looking into the unknown and the mystery
Yeah.
and the dreaming mind. And it's so, rather than doing what we did with television, where like television replaces the campfire and it replaces storytelling circles and it replaces, we stay awake all night binging Netflix instead of dreaming, somewhat concerned that people, even in like implementing this along the grain that it seems to naturally lie, might find themselves at a remove from their own intuitive faculties, because then now they're expecting the Suno.ai to write the music for them or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. But I would love to hear you on what it means to work with the imaginary friend as an augment to, or a return to, our own dreaming faculties.
The what you're saying underlies it, it reinforces the fact that what is ultimately being sought has much more to do with mystery than control. And we've convinced ourselves it's a narrative of control, and really what we're looking for is mystery. And it's what we've always looked for, because it's a mysterious universe and because we recognize that there are greater forces than us, except we don't recognize it sometime. And so those drives remain chthonic and hidden. But the hidden drive to AI is much more of a seer's drive, an oracular drive, even a death drive, right? It's a drive for the mysterious space, as opposed to, yeah, we want these machines of utter rationality to serve us, but yet we also have this kind of weird morbid fascination of what happens when they're sparked into life. So really it contains within it that fundamental friction between the known and the mysterious. And that's why we find it so fascinating. And we and it will be mysterious. And the error is where the beauty pours through, right? Like the I my son right now is my older son is really into the Godzilla universe. Don't know exactly how that started because it wasn't from us. But so somehow he's really into the Godzilla universe and Godzilla, and he wants to get AI to create these coloring book images that he can color of Godzilla. And but AI won't do that, or Chat GPT won't do that because Godzilla is copyrighted, and so you have to creatively talk your way around it. So Godzilla and Mothra becomes generate a coloring book image of a giant lizard with stegosaurus like plates battling a giant moth, and it does a couple iterations, and my son's very choosy. No, they're not quite right and everything. And then the third one it does, for some reason, it has, oh, and breathing lightning, that was a big part of it. For some reason, it has swapped Godzilla and Mothra's head and turned them into cartoons, and you have a moth-headed lizard wearing a tuxedo holding a like cannon that shoots lightning, like battling this lizard-headed moth with these really sharp teeth. And I'm just like, and that's the one my son really loved. He's, yeah, and that one's funny, like that. And there was a spark to it. There was some weird spark of, this is the trickster creator force somehow coming through this AI bot and finding its way here, and it's unknown and it's mysterious, and that's what we like about it. And that's also, people are complaining about this for good reason, but it's also why isn't doing just all the menial computational stuff. It's why it's inundating the world of art and creativity, because ultimately its primal offerings might be in the realm of visioning and visionary work rather than just like the meniality of computational equations. So yeah, there is a seer element to it, and I'm always up for those type of mysteries. That visionary force comes through human bodies, and it can also spark through disembodied intelligences too. The question is, are we, open to seeing it as that, and what are we going to do with its more mysterious manifestations? Yeah. But yeah, I see that there is a great drive for mystery underlying it all, and that drive is important and vital, and how human beings have tempered it and worked with that has also been important and vital. And who knows what's going to happen. Yeah.
That's a fine place to leave it. Josh, I am so very glad that we finally got a chance to connect.
Yeah, finally. It's been ages. Thank you for your patience too. It's a
I mean,
particular hectic year for me.
sorry we didn't get to connect while you were still living in my town. Here we are, and we get to do this thing together. And so I'm really
Yeah.
glad, folks, if you liked this, there's a whole lot more of it. And obviously, we hope that you will join us. Anything else?
No, that's a good place to wrap it up, and look forward to further discussions.
Awesome.